Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network, so join Mary, Shirley, and Lisa Fine as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Welcome to the Great Women in Compliance podcast with Lisa Fine and Mary Shirley. The GWIC podcast is a proud member of the Compliance Podcast Network, which is ably managed by Tom Fox. We're also sponsored by Corporate Compliance Insights, which is a veritable treasure trove of information to keep you up to date on the latest issues in risk, compliance, ethics, privacy, and security. Today's guest is a veritable treasure trove of knowledge as well. I'd like to welcome Debra Sabitini Hennelly to the show. Please tell us about yourself, Debbie, and welcome.
Hi, Mary. Well, I'm just so thrilled to be here. I think what you and Lisa have created is its own treasure trove and such a gift to our profession. So thank you very much for doing that.
Pleasure.
So tell you about myself. I'm a mom of 3 grown daughters. I am a wife and a daughter and a sister and a friend. And I'll bet that's not what you thought I would answer right there.
No, but I like it.
Well, one of the things that I have learned, I guess, over the years is that my work doesn't define me. And it's just a part of who I am. And so what really defines me, I guess, at this point in my life is, what my values are, what drives me. And, what drives me really is my family and being a good role model and a supportive mom and wife and sister and daughter and friend. So how that connects to my work, I suppose, is that my focus is really on the importance of trust and dignity, love, and positivity. And so in all of those roles, including my work, those are the things that guide me. And so from the start of my career, I have always been a learner. I was an engineer. I started as a civil and environmental engineer for supervising construction in the 80s. So you can imagine that I encountered all kinds of interesting things that ultimately fell under a compliance umbrella. But it was really, if I think about my engineering education, it really was a cross-discipline program that I was part of at Duke, where I went to engineering school, called Science, Technology, and Human Values, that always kept me interested in things kind of outside of engineering. How does our work as an engineer or as a company fit into society? How do we do what's right? Just because we can do something doesn't mean it's right to do it. So I suppose there was always part of me that wanted to focus more outside of applied engineering. I came out of law school coincidentally at a time when underground storage tanks were the focus of the EPA here in the States. And so as a baby lawyer in a Washington, D.C. law firm, I was immediately an expert in something, which was kind of a bizarre feeling. And so I practiced environmental law for 5 years. I went in-house at that point because I had given birth to our second and third children, twins, our younger daughters. And someone told me that I needed to go in-house to get a life. And back then, which was I guess it was 1992, that was the case, that lifestyle in-house was better than lifestyle in a law firm. I'm not so sure that is the case anymore. Right. But it was really a very important pivot point in my career. I like to say I'm first generation corporate. My parents are a psychologist and an engineer, but both first generation college and professional school. My father's first generation American. So dropping me into corporate land was like being an alien landing on Earth. And or being an expat. Everybody probably listening to this knows what, well, maybe not everybody, but many people, you certainly know what it feels like to be working in a country that's not your native land. And so there were many, many, many lessons that I learned along the way that were more about how to operate in a corporate environment than about how to be a good environmental lawyer. Interestingly, from an ethics and compliance standpoint, my very first assignment when I went in-house at AT&T, which is where I started, was to support an effort to get the company off of the debarment list, because the company had had its first ever criminal conviction that happened to be in the environmental arena for what was really a very tiny infraction, but at a time when the EPA was trying to use big companies as examples to encourage self-policing, really, which is what a lot of the risk areas we talk about in compliance are all about, right? So my job was to prove that we had an effective compliance program that met the sentencing guidelines when the sentencing guidelines were still sort of, the ink was still wet on the paper, and sort of we were all trying to figure out what they were. And so I had help from some great outside counsel. And, back in those days, everything lived in binders in different parts of the company. And probably the most important thing for me from an ethics and compliance professional standpoint was that I was partnered with the environment and safety director for the business that had this problem. And it was I think $8 or $10 billion business unit. And I very quickly learned the importance of taking a management system approach to driving compliance. And so that meant, because this was AT&T and because Bell Laboratories at the time was sort of the heart of everything that happened there, we all had to learn about quality management systems, even in the law department. Everything we did had to have a quality management focus. And I have used that approach, the plan, do, check, act approach, ever since, in everything that I do with ethics and compliance, with culture, and with leadership. Because it's all about continual improvement, right? Everything we do. So scrolling forward, that became my focus with the second and the first and second spinoffs at AT&T. While I was still responsible for environmental compliance, I was given broader responsibility for other regulatory areas. And as I mentioned, when you had us all thinking about the people who sent elevators back down for us in your book, the woman who sent the elevator back down for me was Pam Craven, who was the general counsel of this new company that had spun off. And she turned to me, this was 1999, turned to me and said, that management system thing you're doing with environmental and some of the other regulatory areas, could you just take that for all of our regulatory areas, all of our compliance stuff, and make a global initiative? So, okay, great. And so that was really the beginning of my ethics and compliance career. I did that. I went, I left the in-house world and went to what was then Integrity Interactive, which is part of SAI Global now, for a couple of years. I went to BP for a year to help create the global ethics and compliance program there. And then, frankly, hit my first really serious burnout in my career and decided that I needed to take a break. And so I hung up a shingle as a consultant and reached out for some of my friends who were also in-house, either compliance lawyers or chief compliance officers, and just said, you have a project I can do. I'm just trying to get my head back on my shoulders before I go back to an in-house job somewhere. And that was 2004. I started, my company was then called Compliance and Ethics Solutions. And, here we are, 16 years later. I renamed the company, rebranded about 3 years ago to be Resility. So our focus is on resilience, since everything we do in ethics and compliance is about organizational resilience. And the work that we do with leadership and culture is about organizational resilience. But I also think that a focus on individual resilience is such an important part of creating psychological safety, and about ethics and compliance professionals, particularly being resilient enough to deal with everything that you have to deal with. So the sort of coaching piece of our business is to help ethics and compliance professionals and in-house lawyers create their own strategies for preventing burnout, or at least recovering from it, and being resilient enough to handle what we handle. We handle a lot. We handle a lot.
I know that burnout is a very complex topic, and in conversations that you and I have had offline, burnout doesn't just happen from being too busy or too overwhelmed with work. It can also happen in situations where you feel like what you're trying to do is, pushing a boulder up a hill and it keeps rolling back down and hitting you and it's futile. Or maybe you've had a major setback and it's caused you a great deal of beyond stress, maybe trauma. Moral injury is a word that you've used, or a term that you've used. So burnout is all encompassing in some respects. It goes far beyond the just being too busy and frazzled. It can have more wide-ranging focuses. And so I don't think we can do it justice in just a small segment of a podcast, but I would like to hear from you if there is anything that you feel like is a piece of low-hanging fruit when it comes to burnout. So if someone's really at the end of their rope and you had the ability to just give them one gem, one really special piece of advice, what would it be?
Be gentle with yourself and put your oxygen mask on first. So, self-care is critical to everything that we do, but particularly in this profession, because for exactly the reason you put your finger on, we are often asked to take on something that's not popular, something that takes a lot of courage, and something we cannot always get the support we need to do. And the moral injury piece of this that you and I have talked about offline is that sometimes we actually run into unethical or inappropriate behavior in this profession, I'm sad to say.
Yeah.
And I would expand that, right? Would you agree? And not just compliance, but legal and compliance. And, we're the people who are supposed to be the guardians of the values and the principles. And so if we find ourselves working for someone who lets us down, betrays us, doesn't support what we're doing, that's almost worse than,
I agree.
Right? Then we know we're going to be pushing a boulder uphill with certain kinds of business people, certain kinds of, narcissists. We don't expect them to be in the law department and the compliance office. And so I guess the be gentle part of this, be gentle with yourself part of this is know that you're not alone. Know that there are many, many of us in this profession who are feeling that kind of, moral injury, betrayal, trauma, even. If there's retaliation involved, if there's harassment, if there's any other kind of bullying, for example, know you're not alone and reach out. This is a wonderful profession of friends and colleagues. and get support for knowing that what you're doing is the right thing, even if you're working for a boss who doesn't get it.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Great advice. Thank you, Debbie. I think
thanks for asking.
Not unrelatedly, I wanted to ask you about psychological safety, because that's an area in which you have a keen interest. We know that from Google studies of successful teams, it's the number one key feature of a successful team. Right. In your own words, will you tell us why psychological safety is so important for workplaces? And I think we kind of got into that, especially in terms of and in respect of compliance programs. Why is it key?
Sure. So psychological safety really has its roots in business productivity and employee retention, and in its earliest days in the 60s, the focus was on team productivity and the free flow of information. I would say Warren Bennis, who's sort of one of the if not one of the granddaddies of ethical leadership, told us that the free flow of information was really the driver of productivity and innovation. And the great thinkers who have come along since, Amy Edmondson, who people are probably familiar with, talked about the connection between psychological safety and team productivity. Tim Clark, who has a great book that I highly recommend, The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, he talks about psychological safety as rewarded vulnerability. So rewarded versus punished. I would maybe paraphrase that as candor. So rewarded candor. Why is it important to us? Well, obviously in the ethics and compliance field, we want people to speak up. We want them to be candid about what's going on, right? We want them to ask questions. But I think it's important for us to make the connection to why the business cares about it. If we're in any organization, not just a for-profit organization, the idea that people need to feel safe and feel that they are welcomed to share their thoughts or their concerns, that is a business productivity interest, not just a compliance interest, right? We want the early warning signals. That's why we want psychological safety. But the business wants ideas, wants people to bring all of their ideas and their whole self to the work that they're doing. That kind of extra effort and feeling engaged. These are some of the things that we measure, corporations measure in employee engagement surveys. Why? Because it's important to the productivity of the organization. It's important to retaining your great talent. So how can we leverage that in the ethics and compliance thing that we've been doing for a number of years is kind of cross-pollinating the demand for the need to feel that you belong to the organization you're working in is what's going to generate psychological safety. And the sort of the overlap between the business needs, the innovation needs, and the integrity or inclusion needs for psychological safety seems to me like a great place for us to connect what we do to the business strategy.
Yeah, that's
actually that I was going to say that was my big aha many years ago when I was in-house and thinking about how to get people to speak up. The employee engagement surveys that many of our companies, probably people listening, have done. One of the things they do ask is if they're based in the Gallup 12 management rubric. One of the things they ask is, I guess you have to rank this statement. My opinion counts at work, right? Or something like, I feel comfortable sharing ideas at work. Well, what I always loved to do was look at that set of results, to find the fruit in where are my champions in the organization for the speaking up culture that we're trying to develop. Because if you can find the managers who are already getting high scores from their people around making people feel comfortable trying new things, it's okay to make mistakes, share your ideas and so forth, ask questions, then it's only about a half a step from there to get them to understand the value of helping people challenge the status quo, raise concerns, ask questions, say, I don't know what to do, right? That's what we need. And that kind of environment really has to come from leadership and management first before it can come from your colleagues.
And then for level setting purposes, I'll ask you to describe in your own words, what is psychological safety?
So for me, I really like the idea of rewarded candor. So I like the idea that when somebody feels like they belong, then they're going to feel safe sharing what's on their mind. And from the standpoint of integrity or inclusion, if someone feels uncomfortable or feels that something's going on that they don't know how to handle it, in a psychologically safe environment, they're going to raise that concern. They're going to challenge the behavior, and they're not going to be retaliated against or snubbed or even some of the, the tiniest behaviors of shunning, not being invited to lunch or on the outing or given the good projects, whatever. In a psychologically safe environment, those things aren't going to happen, because when you speak up, other people are going to say, oh, right, that's what we do here. It's painful to hear, but gee, she's got a point. This is something actually that goes back to the way we built safety cultures in the, at least in my experience in the, in the 80s and 90s, was not the company saying, thou shalt wear a hard hat, or, thou shalt wear safety goggles in the, in the lab. It was your neighbor, your colleague saying, Deb, wear your safety goggles. And me saying, oh, Mary, thank you. Instead of saying, who the heck do you think you are? Right? It's because we care about each other. We belong to each other. And so I'm looking out for you and you're looking out for me. That's kind of at the core of a psychologically safe environment in a culture of integrity. And that's how we have to build cultures of integrity in every other risk area that we have. We together are responsible for each other and for the organization as a whole. And that happens best with psychological safety.
So speaking of the build, what are some low-hanging fruit ways to increase psychological safety in organizations?
Well, my favorite way to do it is with role playing. And that's a lot harder to do now that we've been living in Zoom land for 2 years. But we have a couple of different workshops that we do that are actually kind of fun. They're at first, they're maybe a little uncomfortable, but the idea of playing a character who's either a bully or a leader who doesn't listen, or, all of the characters that we wish we could wave a magic wand and change in order to build psychological safety. Those characters are not me, my boss, my VP. Those are just characters in a story. And then the rest of the characters who have to deal with them we're just play acting, right? We're not really calling anybody out directly. So if we start there with something kind of fun, and we can sort of, as a mirror on our organization, where do these behaviors exist in our organization, in our team? Then we can move from there into, so how'd that feel? And, what worked, what didn't work. Can we use, in our case, we like to use the values of the organization if they're meaningful, because we all know that not everybody's all values are not created equal.
Right.
But if we can connect a speaking up environment with some of the values, then we're helping to create a vocabulary where people can say, I don't think that what's going on here is consistent with our value of fill in the blanks, respect, care, teamwork, whatever. But I do think that the low hanging fruit around getting people to talk, you have to get beyond the culture assessment. That obviously maybe that's not obvious. We have to start with a culture assessment because that's the easiest way to get, sort of the pulse of the environment. But fixing it, the low hanging fruit around fixing it, has to come from getting people to talk about it, because we can't just lecture. We have to get people to apply it, try it, run it through their brain, their heart, and internalize what it takes to create an environment where everybody feels safe to speak up.
Yeah. And interestingly, with culture assessments, on the day that we're recording this, it's the day that's hit the news that Rio Tinto, which is a mining company in Australia, they've just published the results of a culture survey. It's quite grim, but I think to a certain extent that the novelty of them putting this out and having it public shows strong accountability towards
absolutely
taking it seriously and wanting to do the right thing. So that's an interesting movement that we've seen.
It sure is.
That we're seeing currently, and it'll be interesting to see if other companies take the same, take the example and do the same.
Yes, I have to say the hearing the CEO speak about it publicly. I mean, that took courage, obviously.
I agree.
Guts. It's right. It's and humility. But boy, if you want to be accountable, say it out loud. And I give him a lot of credit for that. I mean, obviously there are a lot of things they need to work on. And if they were my client, I would say bravo for having the CEO talk about it. Yeah. But be careful what you commit to. When you do a culture assessment and you find, lots and lots of issues that you want to work on, it's important in my opinion, it's important to just really boil it down, to commit to moving the needle on. If you're doing an assessment every year, and then the other piece of advice is, this isn't just about the leadership creating the environment. I think that it's also about employees engaging on the fix. Because, right. I mean, so first, yes, it's great. The CEO said, we have these results and we're going to address them. Wonderful. Not every company is going to do that publicly, but certainly you want the CEO to tell the employees, we have these results. Here are the results. We want to address them. And we're committing to do, 2 or 3 things this year. In my experience, it's always best to have some employee input on what those 2 or 3 things are, right? So that's where the, focus groups, or I love creating working groups that are cross-functional, cross geography, multi-level, so that you get a good feel for what employees think is possible. But then we really need employees to own it with the leadership. Because we all are part of the culture. The culture is just the sum total of all the behaviors, right? Exactly. And the behaviors, So it's not just leadership that has to change. All of us have to change.
Yeah, I totally agree. We have a phrase at Fresenius, which is we all own compliance. And there's even a slide for slide decks in which you have to speak on the we all own compliance slide for every presentation.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, that's
I might borrow that, Mary. Thank you. With attribution, of course.
Yeah. I'll share some more information with you offline about that one.
Thank you.
So yeah, some really great points there. And I love the focus group suggestion. I have found that really useful for culture surveys, even like my training data analytics. So for example, when you've been training on a certain topic and then you get people telling you that they want more training on that topic, and you're like, I'm going to need to drill down and understand from you, especially when it's topics like, say, retaliation. And, you think, okay, we've been telling you that we have a strict policy against it, But if people still, have that fear, holding focus groups can be a really awesome way to understand the root cause and help you tailor your campaigns in a better way, so that you're, not saying the same thing every time and not getting any results and
not getting traction. Yeah, exactly. You're absolutely. I totally agree. And in looking back now, some of my greatest challenges around culture change of work were convincing leaders to do the assessment in the first place. But the second part was getting employees engaged on the fixes, as opposed to the C-suite saying, okay, HR and compliance, get together and fix this. No, we really need to go out with some focus groups and create some working groups. I, in a couple of cases, was able to get union leadership involved because, they're employees too, they're colleagues too, and excluding them from this is, I think, misguided. But so much of what I've learned over the years really came from not talking, not assuming, not asking leading questions, but asking open-ended questions about why we're getting the results we're getting on culture assessment. And that's hard. We're problem solvers, right? So the leading question is, we think we know why people don't trust senior leadership. So, but instead of asking, is it that you don't see enough of them? No, just say, this was the result. What do you think causes that? And, right. And we can be surprised if our assumptions were wrong. It's always good to challenge our assumptions. Yeah. I think that's such an important part of our professional skepticism, let's say, is, we have to, every once in a while, I think it's Alan Alda quote, says something like, our assumptions are our windows on the world. It's important to clean them off once in a while to make sure we're seeing things clearly. And I think, isn't that good? And I think that is really important to remember when we're analyzing results of whether it's a culture survey or a risk assessment. We shouldn't assume we know what's going on in the business. We should be talking to people directly.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think one of the things that I learned way later than I think I would have liked to have was that I used to think that just, having one country be a pilot country and getting input and feedback from them, that was a sufficient two-way conversation. But I've come to believe that it's not. And when you think about it, in compliance, we request that the business involve us early and often when they are thinking about, engaging in a transaction or doing something. And, if we're asking that of them, then we should be holding ourselves to the same standard. So if you are thinking about reviewing your policies, for example, Novartis had their colleagues help provide input, right, for the code of conduct. If you are thinking about, drawing up your training plan for the next year, what kind of data have you included, or who have you spoken to get qualitative information that will help inform what you're trying to do? Even if it ends up vindicating what you thought, then you can point to,
Yeah.
the rationale and say, this is what the decision making was based on.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, this is what good ethical decision making is all about. So we should model the behavior that we're asking, right?
Exactly.
You think you've made a good decision? Well, try it out on some people. And if they, right? And if they give you different perspectives, maybe you need to tweak your decision. Or if they affirm what you said, if they come to the same conclusion, okay, great. You can feel more confident that the decision you're making is an ethical one. But I love your kind of flipping it back on us. We want them to involve us early and often. Well, how about vice versa?
Right.
So, yeah, that's very good.
Well, I have one more question for you on the psychological safety front, Debbie, and that is, do you believe that where psychological safety has been eroded in a workplace due to incivility within a team, and this is the moral injury type stuff, such as in situations where mobbing or bullying has occurred, or maybe a very ferocious boss that everybody's scared of, intimidating and traumatizing, can psychological safety ever be rebuilt?
Yes. Next question. This is really some of the tough stuff that we grapple with. And it's something that we talk about a bit in our training when we help companies create internal investigations expertise. The idea that when the investigation is over and we've made our recommendations and HR and management have dealt with, the bad behavior, the bully, the boss, whatever, we can't all just, wash our hands and move on, because there's been, in the wake of whatever that behavior was, there's been damage done to the working group, the team, the colleagues. Maybe some of those people were interviewed, they were witnesses, they might have been bystanders, they might have been targets of whatever the behavior was. So it's important that we make sure that there's work done to focus on not just prevention of, the behavior that happened, but that there's work to focus back on the sense of psychological safety and connectedness in the people that remain. So, throughout an investigation, we remind each other that it's important to reiterate the non-retaliation policy, for example. So whether you're talking to, the people you're interviewing or the manager who really wants to stick their nose in whatever you're doing, we have to keep talking about the non-retaliation policy, right? Why? Because of psychological safety. And so when we get through the investigation and we're focused on the preventive action, part of the fix, part of the healing that has to happen is to focus on the needs of the humans who are left behind and make sure they have the support they need to reconnect and, deal with whatever bad feelings there might be. There might be people who disagree about what the outcome of the investigation was. We can't just leave all that dangling, because that the energy that gets focused on harboring those feelings is not going into resuming work, reconnecting with each other, trusting each other, and being, productive together.
I think it's important to be strategic as well with the non-retaliation policy reminders. So one of the times that I like to do that is when interviewing a reporter for an investigation or a witness. And after the updrawn warning, I usually remind them of the non-retaliation policy and that cooperating in this meeting or any other compliance process, you are protected, and remind them of the compliance officer for their business unit by name so that they have that fresh in their minds.
Very good. Yes, very good. Yeah, it's a very important part of what we do.
Well, that brings us to the conclusion of part 1 of a part 2 series with Debbie. Thank you very much for your time, Debbie. Really appreciated speaking with you. And for those of you listening, if you enjoyed this, keep an eye out for Debbie's next episode for part 2, where we'll be talking about ESG, a very hot topic. And you'll recall that Debbie started out in environmental law, so she's slightly on the front foot there compared with just about everybody else. She's also recently started a role as an adjunct professor, so we'll be talking a little bit about what that's like, and then some leadership skills. So join us next time. And Debbie, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks so much, Mary. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.